Hi, I'm Kelsey Schmitz, the School Mental Health Director for the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. We're located at the University of Washington at the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center, or the SMART Center. I want to welcome you back to the second recorded conversation that is part of the Anchored in Our Roots series. Anchored in Our Roots is designed to provide BIPOC school mental health providers resources to navigate the intersectionalities of their work and strategies for anchoring their well-being around their cultural and ancestral roots, which is really where we're going to spend time today. We've centered the needs, the voices, and the lived experiences of BIPOC school mental health providers through these conversations and materials. We welcome non-BIPOC providers to lean in, to listen, and learn how to support our BIPOC colleagues. The series includes foundational resources that are provided in these two conversations, as well as two workbooks to reflect on the conversations that you'll listen to today. Our goal is to help BIPOC school mental health providers access collective support and engagement around wellness topics that collectively impact their work and their identities. Once again, our esteemed colleagues, Dr. Sabine Thomas and Catrice Tybett-Chapin, have developed this incredible material, are creating these conversations and opening up the space for our BIPOC school mental health providers. You can locate all of the materials and the recordings by going to the link that's displayed on the slide. And as before, in a moment, after sharing a few things, I'm going to pass the mic off to them. I want to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. The Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and the University of Washington SMART Center acknowledges that we learn, live, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. We're grateful to respectfully live and work on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. And if you haven't, we really encourage you to take a moment to follow the link that's provided on the slide to learn about the lands that you live, learn, and work on. So again, this work is sponsored by the School Mental Health and the Provider Wellbeing Supplements to the Northwest MHTTC. The Northwest MHTTC is part of a larger network of mental health technology transfer centers across the country and is funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This map, again, helps you locate the regions that we serve, Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, as well as other regions across the United States. You can learn more about our school mental health supplement by following the link on this page and learning more about how to engage with our training, our TA, our newsletters, and other resources to support the school mental health workforce in our region. And again, just a quick disclaimer that the material in this presentation, except for any that was taken from copyrighted sources, is in the public domain and can be reproduced or copied without permission, but we do appreciate citation. We ask that you not reproduce or distribute this presentation for a fee without first contacting us and receiving written authorization. And just a reminder that the opinions that are expressed here are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. So again, I want to take a moment just to introduce you to our outstanding authors and facilitators for this series. Dr. Sabine Thomas is a naturopathic doctor and educator. She has an extensive background in nonprofit management, in wellness, and infant and early childhood mental health, and user experience research. She graduated from Mount Holyoke College with a BA in Socio-Medical Sciences and a doctorate from Bastyr University in naturopathic medicine. She's an early childhood digital ethnographer and a self-care doctor. She is the co-owner of JSOL Studios, a virtual wellness educational practice, and lives in Tacoma, Washington with her family. Catrice Tybett-Chapin is a multiracial educator who has served in the nonprofit sector for over 27 years. She comes from 4 generations of educators who dedicated their life to educational social justice. Catrice has a strong theoretical background in child development and psychology, a BA in child development, a master's in elementary education, and an EDS in school psychology. She works diligently to ensure that everyone who wishes to have a seat at the table has one, feels safe there, and can voice their opinions without retribution. As a practicing school psychologist, she has a special interest in researching and applying best practices in consultation, intervention, and assessment implementation when supporting students and families who are culturally and linguistically diverse. Catrice is an active member of the Washington State Association of School Psychologists and the National Association of School Psychologists, and is also a member of OSPI's School-Based Behavioral Health and Suicide Prevention Subcommittee. When Catrice is away from the office, she enjoys spending time with her husband and 4 daughters. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Catrice.
Thank you so much to Kelsey and the MHTTC network for welcoming Dr. Sabine Thomas and I to share some more information about how we can support BIPOC mental health providers. We have a wonderful session laid out for you today, and we hope you enjoy it. I'm going to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Catrice Tyvett-Chapin. I am a school psychologist supporting Vancouver Public Schools, and I am here today with Dr. Sabine Thomas.
Well, thank you so much, Catrice. And likewise, I'd love to extend a thank you to our awesome team, MHTTC network, specifically members of the Northwest Network, for hosting our conversation. My name is Sabine Thomas. I am a naturopathic physician, and I have had the tremendous fortune to also participate in our state campaign focused on a mindful state. I also am able to support our wonderful JSOL Studios. We're an online digital health practice and are disseminating health and wellness information for the family. So I'm glad to be here. And take it away, Catrice.
Awesome. Well, in our first session, we discussed the different complex roles that school-based mental health providers must interface within the educational institution. So we discussed a little bit about how the educational system is colonized and how we're working to decolonize that. We address oppression and marginalization of certain groups of people and how that impacts the ability for BIPOC school-based mental health providers to support students holistically. We also went through some definitions such as like cultural trauma, racial battle fatigue. We addressed a little bit about how we have to code switch as BIPOC school-based mental health providers and do some cultural weaving in order to accentuate our brilliance and ensure that we are not being oppressed by some of the characteristics of white supremacy culture. So for all those definitions, and if you need to revisit any of those terms, please check out our first ebook that will go deep into those aspects, and also some audio recordings. Today, we're going to talk about the last section of that first ebook, and we're going to dig into what does like radical self-love and care mean. But before we can get to that, we have to talk about how our BIPOC mental health providers, and to be honest, how are all mental health providers supported right now in self-care. So in order to do that, we have to look at what is the structure of self-care? How is it being taught to us within the institutions of instruction? And Dr. Sabine Thomas is going to go a little bit into that with us about what does self-care look like right now, and how do we decolonize some of that?
Well, thank you so much, Catrice. I absolutely enjoy how you have really summarized where we're at in our conversation. And I will highlight that if you have actually gone and listened to the first interaction, the first connection, the first set of conversations that Catrice and I have had, I would absolutely recommend that you have an opportunity to also go through the ebook and the workbook as you are listening to us today. And for our section, there will also be an accompanying ebook. Now, to answer your question, I thought it would be quite important to take a look at a few definitions of self-care, right? And as we're also looking at definitions of self-care, really think a little bit about the authors of some of these definitions. So if you will bear with me, I wanted to just share with you and actually a little bit read through some of these definitions that I've come upon. Because this past 18 months, when we think about the practices of self-care that have blossomed, stretched, expanded, and have taken really a space of their own. Now, when we're really thinking about school mental health providers, and we're thinking about how institutions have traditionally provided self-care, self-care is defined as the practice of taking actions to preserve or improve one's own health, right? The practice of taking an active role in protecting one's own well-being and happiness, in particular during periods of stress. I'm going to pause here and really present this space of during periods of stress. It is possibly implying that there are periods when we're really thinking about BIPOC providers, Black, Indigenous people of color, who don't necessarily have periods of stress, but live in a space of extended stress, right?
Yes.
So that's the first space that I wanted to share. The second definition is the World Health Organization's defining self-care as the ability of individual, families, and communities to promote health, prevent disease, maintain health, and cope with illness and disability with or without the support of a healthcare provider. Completely different set of approach when we're starting to thinking about self-care. And I will say that I absolutely associate a little bit more with the second definition, particularly because it highlights the importance of families and communities. This is unfortunately not how several institutions have really approached self-care. A lot of institutions, particularly these past 18 months, have said, take the time, not the time you may need, take the time, which may often be take a day, take 2 days off, come back, recharge, and let's just accelerate where we may have actually lagged behind. Does that make sense? So it's not necessarily a lifestyle when we're thinking about self-care, when we're thinking about ability of individuals, families, and communities, but it really is self-care has almost been approached as a very quick Band-Aid. Go through it, feel better, do what you need to do, and come back.
Yes.
And really no emphasis around communities. And when I specifically think about the global majority, people of color, I know that self-care is deeply rooted in community.
Yes, yes.
So
we definitely take, I think the BIPOC community takes a collective approach to wellness just because of our roots. Right? You know, we gather together, we stay together, we suffer things together, but we also heal together versus some of the individualistic, what we were reading through those definitions. It's very individualistic, like you handle that. Mm-hmm. However, handling that individually means that you have a set of skills that you can maintain and sustain periodically and regularly. In reality, like you were saying, like when we're facing racial battle fatigue, that is an ongoing stressor that we're.
It is an ongoing stressor by virtue of how we show up in the world. I was having this conversation most recently with my son around gender. He's in this space when I could start really expanding around definition. And it is visible. My pronouns are she and her. I present as a woman. I am a woman, and I am a Black woman, right? And so by virtue of how I show up absolutely in a space without necessarily having to say a word, which most folks say, you have a lovely accent. Where is it from? Your hair, or there is something about how we show up. When I say we, the collective, global majority, communities of color, how we show up, whereby there is instantly that level of micro a microaggression, right? And so it starts, subtle as it may be, we feel it.
Yes.
We feel it because we are such an intuitive people that there's really this opportunity to sense it. And often people will say, oh, there's so much sensitivity there. And absolutely not. We feel it and it impacts us to our core, right? So I share these definitions, but I also came across, and Catrice, you shared several of these quotes as well in the ebook. So I have simply borrowed. And you talk about, you have shared Audre Lorde's definition when we're thinking about self-care, caring for myself, and thinking about Audre Lorde as an equal rights activist. When Ms. Lorde talks about myself, she talks about my community. That's how she shows up. It's not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, which is the stance I've taken when I think about self-care, is how do I take care of myself within the heart of my community? Who do I surround myself? And unfortunately, this is not where institutions have really provided that space. You, as a school psychologist, have gone through this time. We're still going through this pandemic. And when institutions have carved out that space of self-care, it's also not providing not just the tools, the space, the resources. Self-care has also been quite capitalized.
Yes.
Right? Get yourself a pedicure, go to the spa. And for some folks, it may involve consumptions of libations. Otherwise, my libation is usually tea and stuff, but
yes, no, very much so. It becomes a type of, and towards the end of our first video, we talked about how it's like a Band-Aid, right? A Band-Aid on a scar that just keeps being unable to heal.
Yes.
Right? So those capitalistic, they're nice, right? It's nice to get a spa treatment. It's nice to get a massage. It's wonderful to go to a chiropractor and get realigned because you're sitting all day typing or in meetings. Those things are nice and they are very healthy, but are they healing, right? So it is like a Band-Aid, but it's not even the liquid Band-Aid. It's just the one that might have latex in it, right? It might cause some irritation though, so definitely.
You talk about, you talk about caring and healing, and you and I have had several conversations juxtaposing what happens to trauma, right? You go in such depth, really diving into the space of trauma. And many times, trauma is not visible. Many times trauma is not visible, right? And when I think about trauma, I think of a variety of trauma. And if it's a good time for me to go into this space, let me know. But
yes.
I think of really, and Angela Davis dives into this, right? Really thinking about self-care and healing, attention to the body and the spiritual dimensions. And the body, when I think of any assault, I'm going to do a little bit of comparison here, bear with me. When I think of any assault on the skin, recently I fell, scrubbed my knee, and this was a teachable moment with my son where I showed him what happens to, and really, really wanting to make sure that he was not afraid of blood and cuts and so on and so forth. But the most important lesson was for me to explain to him the importance of healing and how it takes place. Yes. And also explain to him the importance of taking care of a specific wound so it doesn't get infected and heals well. Mm-hmm. Trauma, particularly the level of trauma that we've talked about when we're thinking about BIPOC school mental health providers, not just the trauma that they may experience as they engage within the environment, but also the trauma that their clients, students, parents, particularly BIPOC parents, may experience, is often that one that is not seen, right? And so when a scar and any any attack, right, to the skin occurs, a cut and so on and so forth. There is so much happening under the skin that we're not aware of, but it takes a tremendous amount of energy. It takes a tremendous amount of health. It takes a tremendous amount of intention to make sure that it heals well. However, most of the time, unless you have a massive, surgery or a pretty deep cutting a wound, there is an opportunity to scar. This is when I think about trauma. And when I think a little bit about being given the space to heal from multiple trauma. Yes. Although the scars may not be overwhelming, what happens under the skin is an accumulation of several substances, where if you do not see the scar on the skin, there's definitely a scar underneath the skin. And you can feel this in any big scars that you may have. If you slide your hand over it, you can feel a little bit of the accumulation of collagen right underneath your skin. And these are not necessarily scars that are seen, because they're right under that dermis, right on the epidermis of the skin. And when I think about BIPOC providers and the space that they have to go in, consistently having to, in some spaces, rip off that Band-Aid, or it was a very quick Band-Aid that, and there's a case, by the way, from Band-Aid in different types of scars. Not every scar should have a Band-Aid. A lot of scars needs to be given that space, that air, that environment to heal, right? And that is not what happens. So often you end up with scars that either are, revisited, re-impacted, re-affected, in some cases infected if they did not heal very well. And that juxtaposition, right, between trauma and trauma on the skin and that space of healing. And we know this, you and I both know this, when we're thinking about childhood trauma and how often they're revisited, right? But now let's take it to a space within an institution where an individual themselves are going to multiple trauma and multiple wounds that are just not being given that time.
Yes, we spoke about in the first session a little bit about how we nurture our voice and situations in which we are most comfortable with nurturing our voice, and then situation in which we remain silent. And just like what's required for the healing to prevent excessive or erosive scarring, there's going to be times where we're going to we'll be silent because we are just letting the world process itself. We are curious, we are investigating, we are ensuring that we are in a mentally healthy space. And so it's intentional that we are allowing the silence to happen. We're allowing ourselves to breathe through a meeting that might seem contentious, or there's some racial motivations that are oppressive. We might allow that time so we can understand how we're going to go back and address it in a way that we won't scar. Or there might be times where we're in environments where we are silent because of fear of retaliation. We are of fear of being seen as too close to a situation, fear of the paternalism and rule following, which are part of white supremacy culture. When we're in those states as BIPOC mental health providers that we are silenced and we're unable to breathe and to speak our mind, Dr. Thomas, can you tell us a little bit about what happens to our body?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I, Catrice, wanted to highlight, and you've done this so well, I wanted to highlight that in terms of setting the foundation around what happens when we're silenced. I wanted to highlight that I will have definitely the opportunity in our accompanying ebook to really provide some good and extensive amount of information around the physiological impact, right, of silence and racism. And I know we'll touch on it very briefly, but to answer your question around silence, I think that, and I know that there is a purpose. There is a purpose around silence. It is actually one of the strategies I know I would suggest to get into a space of self-care. However, the impact on the body of being forcibly silenced is completely different. This may happen in meetings, in interactions, in emails, whether or not intended, in actions. And it is fundamental for us as individuals to breathe. We need oxygen to breathe. I equate being silenced, and not necessarily taking a moment to be silent, but to be silenced as being snuffed, being really having that opportunity to breathe and to express myself as really another space of trauma, not allowing me to be able to take that important nourishment, one, and two, not allowing me to speak my voice. There are so many areas where we hold tension. And one of these areas is definitely the throat. Right around the throat is where we have two important passageways. We have our esophagus right behind it. We also have our trachea. Trachea allows us to be able to really navigate how we're going to take breath, how we're going to make sure we're not choking, and how we make sure that food, when we're taking in food or anything else, actually ends up in the right part of our body. This is also, energetically speaking, and for anyone who's obviously interested and or deeply rooted in chakras, knows how important of a deep-rooted chakra this is. This is where an incredible foundation of our strength shows up. And so I shared one is really having that cutoff physiologically, right? Literally having that cutoff of oxygen, that important aspect of what we need to have access to in order to regulate ourselves, in order to be able to move on with our daily activity. We need oxygen to breathe. And being silent really puts us in a space of stress. It really puts us in a space of what I call cortisol, hyperload, where we're consistently bathed in this stress hormone. Yes. We're just not able to move along and do what we need to do on a daily basis. And that may be attend meetings, take care of clients, and God forbid, take care of our own families. Yes. And so when you think of the impact of silence and being silent purposely, the impact on our body equates to consistently having that level of exposure to trauma and stress, right? Where we know that there is decreased cognitive function. We know that there is loss of memory when this happens. We know that a lot of our decision making is altered when we do not have access to this oxygen and when we're in a period of stress. And this is what happens. This is what happens when we are being silenced. And this could be new policies. This could be speaking up at a meeting. This could be asking and advocating for our own self-care, where we consistently are being silenced. And or this could literally be with policies. I trust that as we enter this new school year, that school mental health providers, particularly BIPOC school mental health providers, are being given that space to navigate really the intersectionality of how we have experienced the pandemic. For several of us, it is a pandemic, it's still going. Yes. And for most BIPOC folks, we also have had to deal with Asian hate. We've had to deal with the repercussion of the murder of George Floyd. And what I mean by the repercussion is the complete opposite. What has showed up in terms of policies, what has showed up in terms of extremists voicing their opinions, what has showed up in terms of the impact around education, the impact around having conversation about critical race theory. Yes, and that is some part of what what has happened means being silenced
Yes.
in
With
so many ways.
With such a heavy breath that BIPOC community and a lot of our allies, I mean, everyone is experiencing trauma right now. I want to lay that foundation that we are all experiencing, no matter your creed, your ethnicity, your race, we're all experiencing. Amongst BIPOC communities, when we're experiencing it, we have higher medical implications, right? We see a higher rate of heart disease. We see more, so that's like our cardiovascular system. We are seeing more obesity, right? We see a lot of medical implications when people of color are experiencing this heaviness that is snuffing out our ability to breathe. Dr. Thomas, you shared the chakra and the throat being so important. You shared how important it is for us to breathe. A lot of this breathing, a lot of this chakra, it comes from our ancestral roots, right? It comes from what our mothers did, our great-grandmothers did, what our ancestors did in Africa, where my ancestors did in the Middle East. I mean, a lot of this is indigenous, native. It is part of our historical roots. And so for many of us, like myself, I'm trying to figure out, how do I get to know more about how to breathe like my ancestors breathed and were resilient and survived? What kind of strategies? Where do I start? What are a couple of strategies that I can do in order to get connected back with the resiliency and the powerfulness of my ancestors?
Yes. So I will start with this. And our space, Catrice, we really have an opportunity to focus around root work, right? I love the analogy of the tree. I live for the analogy of the tree, and I use it in so many fashion. And to answer your question, particularly when I think of generations and ancestral work and indigenous roots, I think of a system, and we know this. You speak to any agroforester who talks to you about root systems and how literally trees communicate under the surface when we can't see. This is what I think about root work and root systems, right? Is what happens and what has continued to really happen over time when we're thinking about our ancestors. The trunk is a little bit of that communication, is that navigation, how information and or nutrients are really being channeled through the branches and the leaves. And this could be our generations of kiddos. And when I think about my ancestors, this could be my generation, right? Is what are some of the practices, what are some of the rituals that really over time, as they have traversed that trunk, may have changed and may have not been preserved. So I often really think about that cycle, right? You know how sometimes the leaves fall and they actually provide a little bit of nitrogen. I'm taking us away here. But and we essentially provide nutrients back to the roots. But what is important is not just nutrients, but that connection. Is really seeing deeper in terms of having that conversation. And Catrice, I want to highlight that this is work that I myself have engaged in when I think about my roots from the Caribbean, when I think about my time being born and having spent in Central Africa, when I think about my son who is born and raised in the United States of America, who is African American, a Black man being raised here, and really understanding our roots, understanding the earth, understanding the space, hence the reason why we often talk about land acknowledgement. Understand what has happened on the land. Yes. Understand how the land has shaped how we connect with ourselves and how we connect really within a community. And so with that said, and having laid a foundation around deep root work and really thinking about the analogy, it also means for me, particularly going back to my roots as a naturopathic physician, to engage with nature, to think about the healing power of nature. And with that said, that means strategies that really don't necessarily involve, and please understand that if one finds solace, relief, and space in a manicure and a pedicure, do it. As indigenous, as really offsprings of indigenous people, we respond incredibly well to rhythm. To rhythm, to having that connection with the ground, to really have these nerve endings of our feet actually touch the ground, and repetition. And kids do it all the time, and they do it so well, right? But specifically for us, right, as descendants of indigenous folks, as really being able to do a little bit of that ancestral work around the earth and the ground is, I will say, dancing, that celebration, one. Two, it still involves being able to walk and or to feel, to have that connection to the earth. I know that when my son goes out in the garden, I often hear sometimes my mom say, put some shoes on this boy. And I say, I think it is incredibly important to put some shoes, when it's appropriate. We also need to go back to having that deep connection. I can't tell you the amount of reflection that takes place when I'm able to take a walk and actually have the sole of my foot, the sole of my feet actually connected with the ground. What happens when I'm able to take my breath sound different, my cadence, my walk, my gait is completely different, right? So movement, I say dancing because in any single one of our ancestral indigenous cultures, we have dancing, we have drum, we have call and answer. So getting back to what brings you joy. And people say, I can't dance. Listen to it. Listen to the drum, listen to the call. Movement, breathing. We started by talking about silence, right? Being silenced. So there are two ways I want to talk about breathing. Is one, being in a space of silence. Silence has its place when you have decided to enter a space of silence. It provides you with that calm, your blood, your heart rate is regulated. Your blood pressure is regulated. There is so much clarity. My mom often says, you often talk to yourself, or I said, absolutely. I sometimes miss having the opportunity to engage with myself. We forget. We're consistently in a space where we have to hold so much energy to engage with each other. But in that space of reflection, I go beyond engaging with myself. This is when I'm able to really get into that deep work. And for folks, it may mean getting into this space of meditation. That's what I mean by silence. Getting to this space of prayer, or getting into this space of deep reflection and gratitude. I have heard so many providers say, I don't pray, I don't meditate, I can't do yoga. And we can absolutely also talk a little bit about what yoga also has looked like in terms of cooptation and misappropriation. But I will divert to this a little bit in a separate conversation. But what I wanted to share is even practicing deep gratitude. As we are in a space of being silenced, it continuously puts us in this consistent space of stress. Gratitude has shown to have that positive impact on the body. And it is also a practice, Catrice. I wanted to share that institutions often have provided as a take one dose of a day, right? Take a little bit of vitamin C on one day, take your vitamin D on another. And I want to share that self-care and self-preservation is a consistent practice, is really creating that space for yourself, where you're able to really engage, right? Engage in that space. And then there is food, and what I like to call it, kind of that deep root work, herb root work, is engaging with food that really feed our soul. It is a little different when we're uprooted and away from our native land, away from our ancestral land. But that also means community, right? I can tell you that I engage very differently with a cup of chocolate where the chocolate has been harvested in Haiti or in Senegal. It's a whole different level of interaction, right, that I have with my food. When my, incredibly luckily, I have family here. So when a meal is being prepared with the spices, when I'm able to eat some of that fufu with my hands, I engage with food very differently. And so for our BIPOC school mental health providers who have these roots, continue to dig back into them, continue to engage with this root, ask questions to ancestors. And ancestors may mean a parent, a grandparent. Take what you need to take and let go of what you need to let go. There's so much that happens, right, when we ask these questions. There are some things we wish we did not need to know, and others that for me certainly have been aha moments. So engaging with the teas from back home, engaging with the food from back home, engaging back in chants. I'm teaching my son a lot of what I may have not learned in terms of language and rhythm. And it's beautiful, right, to see that these roots are starting back up, right? I'm having that full on connection. Catrice, I've spoken quite a bit here. I want to pause.
I'm like, it's like soul food. So I was like, this is soul food. This is what we need for like nourishment. And then I thought, oh, soul food. And I was like, ooh, my mom's collard greens are so good. So it's kind of early. So I'm like, ooh, that would be really good, right, for dinner. But I thought about just when we think about like soul food, we're really thinking about like the nourishment that our ancestors had, some limited, but how they made it work and how they made it stretch, how they created substance for themselves. So I was just like processing it all, because it's all very relevant. I have my 16-month-old Isa, and we just walk around barefoot all the time, every day, in the grass, in the sand, in the dirt. And that's why I get my pedicures, because I need to like nourish my feet after all that earth walking. And just, it is wonderful just to see her just move. Like toddlers and preschoolers and infants, once they get their little motor sensory pieces together in a line, they are amazing, and it's sweet and so precious. And I think that's another thing of just when I think about my personal self-care, I love working with children. I love working with young adults because they bring such energy to situations that we find redundant, are just really heavy. They bring this fresh air to it, and they're so curious. And they want to know stories. And so when you discuss talking with our ancestors, talking with people or communities of people who did the work, who are doing the work, who survived, who fed us, who raised gardens and herbs, just that idea of we as BIPOC community, we told stories, right? We wrote books, we told stories. This was our written, our narrative was oral.
Yes, we chanted. Yes, we chanted, we drew. If we did not write a lot of, when I was, just a very quick story, which I thought was fascinating. We teach rhymes, right? Early on to kiddos so that they could actually capture sentences, capture rhythm, capture patterns, right? There's a reason for that. And when I was attending medical school, one our lovely and Chance, who would have thought, her last name was Thomas. So she always had a special place for me in terms of, well, the special place was, I'm keeping an eye on you there because you're representing me. But, a nod to Dr. Thomas, she was sharing with us that in India, long time ago, when doctors, homeopathic doctors at that, which means an entire layer of knowledge, of ancestral knowledge, needed to learn their anatomy, they learned it by chanting. Isn't that interesting? Because it is deeply rooted in the culture to be able to sing our nursery, and our rhymes. This is traditionally what happens. I move differently when I hear a song that my father or my mom, used to play when I was growing up. It just brings me back full circle. And today I pay attention to some of these words, quite a bit of wisdom, right? Back in our blues, our old spirituals, right?
Anything right now with music going back is probably a good idea.
Yes, our cells vibrate completely differently to music, particularly ancestral music, which is the reason why I talked about rhythm and drumming.
Maybe in another, I know we're kind of wrapping this up, but I know you have probably a wealth of information just about vibrations and energy. And we would love to hear more about, I would personally love to hear more about that, because I think that we are made up of energy. And we experience vibrations. And some people we talked earlier in the session just about sensitivity.
Yes.
Things. And there is something about just being sensitive, being empathic, just being aware of some people saying, oh, you're super sensitive, or, when they experience something, they experiencing it too much. It's kind of like being on that spectrum of the emotional regulation, self-regulation, self-awareness. And I think there's something to say that there's nothing wrong with that. I want to acknowledge that. I want to actually say that's actually, that could be actually a wonderful asset if you're able to channel that.
Catrice, if there is anywhere for us to even, and there would be no better place than what you've just shared, right? To kind of bring it back to institutions and self-care and BIPOC school mental health provider is to honor that space, that maybe that area where you feel like, oh my goodness, I can't speak, I'm not sure why. That's because you have captured, that's because you have been able to really feel, right? Either that aggression or that space of trauma where due to your level of sensitivity, and I mean it to the best degree, which is what you've shared in the best sense of the word, is do not lose that capacity to feel that connection to the root system that we talked about. Feel that connection to your skin. Let your nerve endings and otherwise spiritual nerve ending let you know that you have felt something. That is where being silenced, even if no one is telling us we're silenced, that is another form of being silenced, is when you're not allowing yourself to have that space of intuition and that level of sensitivity. And really that is self-care. I feel something, I'm going to act upon it. I'm going to go dance, walk, have that food, talk to somebody about it, and be in community, right? So I just wanted to
oh, I love it. You have a part 3? Just kidding.
Wait, it's coming up.
Okay. Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Dr. Thomas, for just breaking bread, for talking about how we can love ourselves, get back to our root system. Thank you so much to the MHTTC team again. Kelsey, thank you. It's been a pleasure to work with Dr. Thomas. I've learned a wealth of information. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Catrice.
Thank you so much again to both of you, Sabine and Catrice, for just another really terrific conversation. And I really think we can make a part 3 happen. It was really so interesting to hear you talk about scarring and healing, and often the fact that trauma isn't visible. I appreciated the conversation around structuring self-care and decolonizing self-care. The conversation around silence and being silenced, and racism and the impact on the body that has. And, again, illuminating the fact that BIPOC individuals have experienced multiple pandemics, right? COVID and racism, and the impact that has on our BIPOC colleagues, families, friends, neighbors. And I think, the most powerful piece to me was really this discussion about the deep root work and the analogy, Sabine, that you provided of the tree and its connection to ancestors, and the importance of understanding those roots and the space and the land, and talking about the healing power of nature and rhythm. So again, I just want to tell both of you how much I deeply appreciate you opening up and sharing your experiences and sharing your strategies around well-being, and hope that folks have taken away from this ways and strategies that they can embed into their own self-care work. So again, just as we wrap up, you are welcome to reach out to us at the Northwest MHTTC, the School Mental Health Supplement, and the Wellbeing Provider Supplement sponsored these conversations. And we have a wealth of other training and recorded sessions and products that can help you in your school mental health efforts. We welcome you to join, sign up for our newsletter and connect with us on social media. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us today.